The sharp rap of knuckles against glass made Monica's pulse slow, steady. She had seen this moment coming the second she spotted the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. "Step out of the vehicle," Lawson ordered. His voice clipped, impatient. Monica didn't move. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" His eyes narrowed. "Step out, now." Then, with the kind of measured calm that only came from experience, Monica unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed the door open. The evening air was cooler now, the last streaks of sunlight fading behind the Sacramento skyline. Lawson took a step back, hand resting near his holster. He was sizing her up. "Turn around. Hands on the car." Monica exhaled slowly. The moment stretched, heavy with the weight of what would come next. What happens when the hunter realizes he has misjudged his prey? Subscribe now and continue following Monica's story. The golden hues of the setting sun stretched across the Sacramento skyline, casting long shadows over the quiet suburban streets. Monica Hayes adjusted her rearview mirror, watching as a few early evening joggers passed by. She had just finished a long day at the office, and all she wanted was to get home, kick off her heels, and unwind. But the sudden flash of red and blue in her mirror shattered that thought. Her stomach tightened. Not again. She let out a slow breath and signaled before carefully pulling her black sedan to the side of the road. As she came to a complete stop, Monica's hands rested deliberately on the steering wheel, fingers splayed out, visible, non-threatening, controlled. She had been in this situation too many times before to make even the smallest mistake. In the side mirror, she watched the officer approach. The name tag on his chest read B. Lawson. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an air of quiet authority. Early 30s, by Monica's guess. His expression was unreadable, but his stance was tense. One hand resting on his belt, just a little too close to his holster for comfort. When he reached her window, he didn't offer a greeting. "License and registration," he said, his voice clipped, professional, but lacking any courtesy. Monica turned toward him slowly, keeping her movements deliberate. "Of course, officer." Her voice was calm, measured. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" "You rolled through that stop sign back there," Lawson replied, his tone flat. Monica's jaw tightened. She knew she had come to a full stop. She had been paying attention. But she also knew that arguing wouldn't get her anywhere. She nodded once and reached for her purse on the passenger seat. "I'm going to grab my wallet now," she said clearly. Lawson didn't respond, but his posture shifted ever so slightly, his fingers flexing near his belt. Monica retrieved her wallet, pulled out her license, and handed it over along with her registration. Lawson took the documents but barely looked at them before his eyes flicked back to her. "Where are you coming from?" Monica arched a brow. That wasn't a question typically necessary for a routine stop. "Work," she answered. "What kind of work?" There it was, the shift in tone, the slight suspicion woven into the seemingly harmless inquiry. Monica had seen this play out before. "I work in law enforcement," she replied simply, offering no further details. Lawson's expression didn't change, but his eyes lingered on her, as if searching for something. Something that would justify whatever narrative had already formed in his mind. "Wait here." Monica let out a slow breath as Lawson turned and walked back to his cruiser. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 6:42 p.m. The sun was dipping lower, painting the sky in streaks of amber and crimson. She drummed her fingers lightly on the wheel. She knew she wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Monica kept her hands steady on the wheel, her fingers tapping an even rhythm against the smooth leather. In the rearview mirror, she watched Lawson lingering by his cruiser, deliberately stretching out the silence, letting the weight of uncertainty settle over the moment. She recognized the tactic: make them wait, make them uneasy, make them question themselves. But Monica wasn't one to break easily. Her gaze flicked to the empty street. A jogger had passed earlier, but now the quiet suburban road was bathed in the golden hues of the setting sun. No witnesses, not that it mattered. She had done nothing wrong. And yet, the tension in her shoulders refused to ease. The crunch of boots against pavement signaled Lawson's return. This time, his steps were heavier, his posture rigid with intent. Monica braced herself. "Step out of the vehicle." She inhaled slowly, keeping her expression neutral. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" His gaze darkened. "Step out of the car, now." Monica weighed her options. Resist, and he would escalate. Comply, and she'd be handing him control. She knew how this played out. It was never designed for her to win. With deliberate movements, she unfastened her seatbelt and pushed the door open. As she stood, she was immediately aware of Lawson positioning himself to loom over her. His broad shoulders squared, his stance widened, a calculated display of dominance. She refused to shrink. "Turn around, hands on the car." She hesitated. "Am I being detained?" Lawson's fingers flexed near his holster. A subtle but intentional movement. "For my safety, I need to check you for weapons." Her jaw tightened. "I do not consent to an unwarranted search." His face remained unreadable. "Turn around." Anger burned at the back of her throat, but she swallowed it down. She had seen this before. The assumption, the escalation, the justification that would follow. Different streets, different badges, same script. She turned, pressing her hands flat against the cool metal of the car. Lawson stepped closer, and she felt the weight of his presence behind her. The search was excessive, methodical in a way that went beyond protocol. His hands lingered longer than necessary. Her teeth clenched, but she remained silent. Finally, he stepped back. "Turn around." Monica faced him, her expression unreadable. She saw it now, the flicker of frustration in his eyes. He had expected fear, resistance, an outburst. Instead, she had given him control without surrendering herself. And that unsettled him. "What's in the trunk?" he asked. His tone clipped. She arched a brow. "Luggage, work files, a pair of running shoes." "Open it." She exhaled sharply. "Do you have probable cause?" His jaw flexed. He wasn't used to being questioned, least of all with such calm certainty. "You're acting suspicious." She tilted her head slightly. "Am I?" His eyes narrowed. "Open the trunk." For a moment, she considered refusing, forcing him to justify himself further. But that would mean prolonging this encounter, giving him more space to escalate. And she was tired. Without a word, she walked to the back of the car and popped the trunk. Lawson stepped forward, scanning the contents. A duffel bag, neatly stacked files, a spare jacket. Nothing unusual. Still he lingered, as if willing something incriminating to appear. Monica crossed her arms. "Find what you're looking for?" His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Instead, he slammed the trunk shut, the sound cracking through the quiet street. Monica didn't move. She knew better than to turn her back on a man grasping for control. Monica stood her ground, her expression calm, measured, unshaken. She could see the frustration in Lawson's eyes, the way his jaw tightened as he struggled to maintain control of the situation. He had searched her, forced her out of her car, made her jump through every unnecessary hoop, and yet nothing. No weapons, no drugs, no cause for further escalation. And now, the moment of truth. She reached into her coat pocket, slow and deliberate, watching as Lawson's fingers instinctively inched toward his holster. That reaction alone told her everything. He still saw her as a threat, a problem to be contained. "Relax, officer," she said smoothly, her voice cool but firm. "I'm just grabbing my ID." She pulled out her badge and held it up between them. The small, gleaming emblem of the Internal Affairs Bureau caught the fading sunlight, illuminating the words, "Senior Investigator, Office of Internal Affairs," beneath her name. Lawson's entire body stiffened. His eyes flicked between the badge and her face, processing the weight of his mistake in real time. Silence stretched between them. "You ran my plates," Monica said, tilting her head slightly. "You really didn't recognize the name?" Lawson's lips parted slightly, but no words came. His arrogance, his rigid authority, all of it cracked under the weight of realization. Monica took a slow step forward. "You profile people, don't you, Officer Lawson? You see a woman like me driving a nice car in a nice neighborhood, and you assume something's off. You assume she doesn't belong. That's not—" He stopped himself, but the protest had already died in his throat. "Not what?" Monica challenged. "Not what it looks like? Not what you were doing?" Lawson swallowed hard. The confidence, the quiet dominance he had carried moments ago, it was gone. "I asked you a question, officer," Monica pressed. His throat worked as he tried to find the right words, but there were none. "Let me help you," she said, stepping closer. "You made an assumption. You saw a black woman alone in a car she could actually afford and thought it was worth investigating. You escalated because I didn't give you the reaction you expected. You pushed because you thought you could, because you assumed I had no power." Lawson blinked rapidly, his breathing uneven now. "But here's the thing," Monica continued, her voice cutting through the thick silence like a blade. "You weren't expecting this, were you? You weren't expecting me to be someone who could ruin your career with a single report." I... Lawson's voice cracked before he could finish. He exhaled sharply, his stance shifting. "You've done this before," Monica said, her tone quieter now, but no less sharp. "Haven't you?" Lawson said nothing, but the flicker in his eyes told her enough. Monica held his gaze. "I wonder how many people you've pulled over with the same routine. How many of them didn't have a badge to pull out? How many of them didn't have a way to fight back?" Lawson's jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward his cruiser as if contemplating escape. But there was nowhere to go. Monica let the silence stretch before she spoke again. "You can keep standing here, trying to figure out how to talk your way out of this. Or you can do the only thing left to do." Lawson hesitated. Then, with slow, reluctant movements, he took a step back. "Ma'am, I—" Monica raised a hand, cutting him off. "Don't ma'am me now." Lawson inhaled deeply, forcing his hands behind his back to keep them from trembling. Monica studied him for a long moment. "You're lucky," she said finally. "Lucky that I'm the one standing here instead of someone else. Someone who might actually want revenge." She took another step forward, close enough now that Lawson had to meet her eyes. "But let me be clear. This doesn't end here. You will be hearing from my office." Lawson's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Monica took her time walking back to her car. She slid into the driver's seat, adjusted her mirrors, and let the moment settle. Then, with the same steady composure she had held throughout, she drove away, leaving Lawson standing there, exposed, shaken, and for the first time afraid. Monica sat at her desk, her fingers moving with practiced ease across the keyboard as she pulled up Officer Lawson's personnel file. The fluorescent lights above cast a sterile glow over the sleek surface of her desk, but she barely noticed. Her focus was locked on the screen in front of her. As the file loaded, a sinking sense of familiarity settled over her. She had seen this before: officers with long histories of misconduct, patterns of behavior that should have raised red flags, but never did. The system had a way of protecting its own. Excessive force complaint, unsubstantiated; unlawful stop, lack of evidence; verbal misconduct, dismissed. The list went on. Nothing severe enough to remove him, but too many instances to ignore. A pattern, a warning that had been overlooked. Monica leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just about Lawson. He was a symptom of a larger problem, a culture that allowed officers like him to slip through the cracks, unchecked, unchallenged, a culture that turned a blind eye until the damage was too great to ignore. She tapped a few more keys, widening her search. If Lawson had gotten away with this much, there were bound to be others. And sure enough, more names appeared. Officers with eerily similar records. Complaints that had gone nowhere. Reports buried in bureaucratic limbo. Monica's jaw tightened. This wasn't incompetence. It was willful negligence. Her eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. 10:27 a.m. She had seen enough. Chief Daniels's office was as polished as ever. Dark mahogany desk, neatly arranged commendations on the wall, the faint scent of old leather and coffee lingering in the air. But Monica barely noticed the decor as she stepped inside, clutching the folder of evidence in her hand. Daniels looked up from his paperwork, his sharp blue eyes assessing her with curiosity. "Monica," he greeted, "what can I do for you?" She didn't waste time. "We need to talk about Officer Lawson." The chief sighed, setting his pen down. "I heard about last night. He called me this morning." Monica arched a brow. "Did he?" "He said there was a misunderstanding." She let out a humorless laugh. "A misunderstanding?" She placed the folder on his desk and flipped it open. "Because what I see here is a pattern of racial profiling, unlawful stops, and excessive force complaints that have all conveniently disappeared." Daniel's gaze hardened. "Those complaints were investigated." "No," Monica corrected, tapping the file. "They were dismissed. There's a difference." The chief leaned back in his chair, regarding her carefully. "What exactly are you proposing?" Monica met his gaze without hesitation. "Reform. We need an internal review system that doesn't just sweep these cases under the rug. We need oversight, real oversight." not just paperwork that gets filed away and forgotten. Daniel sighed again, rubbing his temple. Monica, you know as well as I do that pushing for systemic change is easier said than done. I know, she admitted, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Daniels exhaled, nodding slowly. Put together a report. Show me exactly what you're proposing. Monica didn't hesitate. Already did. She slid another document across the desk. This is just the beginning, Chief. If we don't address this now, it's only a matter of time before the next misunderstanding turns into something worse. Daniels studied her for a long moment before nodding. All right, let's get to work. The following morning, the conference room at headquarters was filled with an unusual air of tension. Officers sat stiffly in their chairs, some leaning forward with their arms crossed, others murmuring in hushed tones. Monica could feel the weight of their stares, some curious, some skeptical, a few outright hostile. Word had traveled fast. An internal review meeting was no small thing, especially when it involved one of their own. Chief Daniels sat at the head of the long oak table, his expression unreadable as he sifted through a stack of reports. Across from Monica, Officer Lawson sat rigid, his fingers curled into tight fists on the tabletop. His usual air of arrogance had dulled into something more controlled, but Monica could still sense the resentment just beneath the surface. Daniels cleared his throat, cutting through the tense silence. We're here to discuss the findings regarding Officer Lawson's recent actions and to address broader concerns regarding our department's accountability measures. His voice was measured, steady, neither condemning nor absolving. Officer Lawson, do you have anything to say before we proceed? Lawson exhaled through his nose, his jaw tight. For a moment, it looked as if he might refuse to speak altogether, but then, in a clipped voice, he said, I did what I thought was necessary at the time. If I overstepped, I accept responsibility for that. His words were calculated, measured, but there was no true remorse in them. Monica watched him carefully. You did overstep, Officer Lawson, and not just with me. Your record speaks for itself. She tapped the file on the table for emphasis. Unlawful stops, profiling, unwarranted searches. The question isn't whether you accept responsibility. The question is, why were you allowed to continue unchecked for so long? The murmurs in the room grew louder. Some officers exchanged uneasy glances. Others stared at Monica with open challenge in their eyes. Lawson's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't respond. Daniels turned his attention back to Monica. Agent Hayes, you've conducted your own review of these incidents. What's your assessment? Monica sat straighter in her chair, speaking clearly. This case isn't just about one officer's misconduct. It's about a systemic failure. Officer Lawson was able to continue this pattern of behavior because there were no real consequences. The complaints against him were dismissed, buried in bureaucratic red tape, or waved off as minor infractions. That isn't just a failure on his part. It's a failure of leadership, a failure of oversight. A heavy silence followed. Even Daniels seemed to absorb the weight of her words. Monica continued, her voice unwavering. If it hadn't been me that night, if it had been someone without the ability to push back, how far would he have taken it? That's the real issue here. He assumed I had no power. That's why he escalated. But how many times has that happened before? With someone who didn't have the authority to challenge it? Lawson's face darkened. I wasn't profiling, weren't you? Monica interrupted smoothly. If I had been a white woman in a business suit driving the same car, would you have reacted the same way? Lawson had no response to that. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temple. The board has reviewed the case, and while no criminal charges will be filed against Officer Lawson, we can't ignore what this represents. He straightened. Effective immediately, we will be implementing a department-wide review of all stop and search procedures, retraining officers on proper protocol, and establishing an independent oversight committee to handle complaints. No more automatic dismissals. Every case will be reviewed with full transparency. Monica could see the ripple of reactions across the room. Some officers nodded in approval, while others looked distinctly uncomfortable. Change was never easy, and this kind of change was bound to be met with resistance. Daniels continued, his tone firm. Additionally, Officer Lawson will be placed on administrative leave pending further evaluation. His future with this department will depend on the results of that review. Lawson's jaw clenched. So that's it? You're throwing me under the bus to save face? Daniel's gaze sharpened. Number. You put yourself in this position, and this department is done protecting officers who abuse their authority. This is bigger than you, Lawson. Monica studied him, watching the flicker of emotion behind his eyes. Was it anger, fear, or maybe, just maybe, the beginnings of realization? She leaned forward. This isn't about punishing individual officers. It's about fixing a broken system. If we don't address this now, it's only a matter of time before the next misunderstanding turns into something worse. And next time, we may not be sitting in a meeting room discussing it. Next time, we might be reading about it in a headline. Another heavy silence filled the room. The weight of her words settled over them all. Daniels nodded. We will also be requiring implicit bias training for all officers moving forward. An IA will be conducting a full review of past complaints that were dismissed without proper investigation. The murmurs in the room intensified. Some officers bristled at the idea. Others looked relieved. Lawson shook his head, laughing bitterly. You really think this is going to fix anything? Monica met his gaze evenly. It's a start. She pushed back her chair and stood, gathering her files. The meeting had accomplished what she had hoped. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and the road ahead would be difficult, but the first crack in the system had formed. As she walked toward the door, she heard Daniel's voice behind her. Meeting adjourned. These changes go into effect immediately. Monica allowed herself a small, quiet breath of relief. One battle won. But the war was far from over. The days following the internal review meeting were anything but quiet. Monica found herself at the center of a growing movement within the department. A push for real, tangible change. Some officers resisted, grumbling about new policies and unnecessary scrutiny. But others, including younger recruits and veterans who had long been disillusioned by the old system, quietly voiced their support. Change was coming, whether the department was ready for it or not. Monica spent her days overseeing the restructuring of internal affairs policies, ensuring that accountability was not just a buzzword, but a practice embedded into every level of leadership. Implicit bias training became mandatory. An independent civilian oversight committee was formed, ensuring that complaints from the public weren't ignored or buried under bureaucracy. Most importantly, Monica pushed for transparency. The department would now publish quarterly reports detailing the number of stops, searches, and complaints filed against officers. No more hiding. No more silence. But it wasn't enough to change things internally. People needed to see the change. A week later, Monica stood in front of a podium at a community event, hosted at a local civic center. The room was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras rolling, while community leaders, activists, and everyday citizens filled the rows of chairs before her. The tension in the air was palpable. Monica adjusted the microphone, scanning the crowd before she spoke. I stand before you today not just as an officer, not just as an investigator, but as someone who understands the weight of injustice. She let the words settle, making eye contact with different people in the audience. For too long, we've asked the public to trust law enforcement without demanding that law enforcement earn that trust. That ends today. A murmur swept through the crowd. We cannot ask for respect while operating in secrecy. We cannot demand compliance while allowing abuse of power to go unchecked. And we certainly cannot claim to uphold justice when justice is only afforded to those with privilege. She saw a man in the front row nodding, an elder in the community who had spoken out against police misconduct for years. Next to him, a young woman crossed her arms, skepticism clear on her face. Monica welcomed it. Skepticism meant people were paying attention. When I was pulled over last week, I was reminded of something many in this room already know too well, she continued. The fear, the uncertainty, the awareness that in an instant, a routine stop can become something far more dangerous, not because of what you've done, but because of who you are perceived to be. A hush fell over the crowd. But let me be clear, this isn't about one officer, one incident, or one department. This is about a system that has allowed unchecked power to overshadow its duty to serve and protect everyone. She straightened, her voice unwavering. I have spent the last week pushing for reform within our department, and I promise you, this is just the beginning. Effective immediately, we have established a civilian oversight board to review misconduct complaints. Officers will undergo new training to address bias and de-escalation tactics. And most importantly, every action we take will be open for public review. There was a moment of silence. Then a ripple of applause began, growing louder. But I need something from you, she said, raising her hand to quiet the crowd. I need your voices. I need your vigilance. Change doesn't happen in a meeting room. It happens when a community demands better. Hold us accountable. Challenge us. Make sure these promises don't fade once the cameras stop rolling. More applause. Some people stood, nodding, clapping. She met their gaze, letting them see the sincerity in her eyes. This is not a favor. This is not generosity. This is what you deserve. This is the standard we should have upheld all along. And from this day forward, it will be the standard. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for her. It was for the possibility of something better. As Monica stepped away from the podium, she knew the fight wasn't over. Resistance would come. Some would try to undermine the changes. Others would say she was disrupting tradition. But tradition meant nothing if it stood in the way of justice. And Monica Hayes had never been one to back down.
Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any future content. And most importantly, drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. What was your favorite part? Is there anything you'd like to see in the next video? Let's chat. See you in the next one.